Harry was at the NBA Finals. He was in the 8th row, not courtside, not in the kind of seat that says this person matters to this event in a way the event wants visible. 8 rows back, photographed in a crowd that was mostly there for the basketball, looking like someone who had been invited rather than someone who had been sought. Someone online. And the comments spread quickly. Noted that the 8th row is roughly where you end up when you are 8th in line to the throne, and nobody in the building has formally decided how to rank you. That is a joke, not a factual argument. But the speed with which it traveled and how far it went tells you something specific about where the public conversation about Harry's status is sitting right now. Somehow this balloons from an event that cost $1 million the first year they did to $63 million now. Harry has ballooned the budget from $1 million. It cost $1 million with 400 people. It's now $63 million with an extra 140 people. I mean, that's insane. Tonight we are going through the NBA moment in full, what the Spike Lee interaction generated, and why it spread the way it did, the specific and documentable connections between Time magazine, Better Up, and Harry's Time 100 recognition that observers have been mapping, the credit dispute over the Invictus financial research that became its own story within the larger story, and the question that keeps resurfacing about where the Invictus Games actually came from. Whether Harry built it or whether he was handed a project that the institutional machinery had substantially developed. We are also going through the Birmingham and San Diego chapters, Australia's exit, and what the A's Ever brand's current trajectory says about the broader commercial picture. A lot of threads. Let's pull them one at a time and be honest about what each one actually shows. Let's start with the NBA because the 8th row moment is the one that spread furthest and fastest this week, and because the reason it spread is more interesting and more revealing than the photograph itself. Has Spike Lee rejected Prince Harry's handshake in an awkward moment during the New York Knicks vs. San Antonio Spurs game, as seen in an exclusive "Oh, the awkward" video. The NBA commissioner invited Harry to the finals in San Antonio as a reported guest. Harry attended. Cameras caught him in the crowd during a broadcast moment. The notable detail, the one that generated the most commentary and the fastest spread across social media, was where he was sitting. Not the floor, not courtside, where the cameras regularly cut during play to show who is there and what they think of what they are watching. Not in the front few rows where the seating communicates that the event organizers have made a decision about this person's importance to the room. 8 rows back. Visible but not prominent. Invited but not featured. Online commentary has a specific and well-developed vocabulary for this kind of moment, and it reached for that vocabulary within minutes. The 8th row is not an insult. You can be a personal guest of the commissioner and still end up in the 8th row. You can be important to the evening without being courtside, but the context matters enormously, and the context here is a trajectory. A year ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, Harry's public profile would have commanded a different placement almost automatically. Not because of who he is as a person, but because of what his presence communicated to the media environment around the event. £100,000 go toward the vets. 200,000 miles out of 63 million. What did the trajectory implied by the 8th row, not the seat itself, but what the seat communicates about his current value to the event's public image, is what the memes and the comments were actually processing. The specific comment that spread most widely, 8th row for the man who's 8th in line to the throne, is a joke, not a serious analysis. But jokes spread when they capture something real, and this one spread very fast. The Spike Lee moment extended the conversation in a direction that was even less controllable. Cameras caught a brief exchange between Harry and Spike Lee during the event. Social media users began interpreting it immediately and divided sharply based on their existing dispositions. Some read it as Harry offering a greeting or a handshake that was not accepted in the way he expected, with Lee's response characterized as dismissive or redirecting. Others said the footage was too brief, too ambiguous, and too easily misread to support any specific conclusion about what either person intended. The clip spread because people wanted it to mean something. And what they wanted it to mean depended almost entirely on what they already believed about Harry's social standing in the spaces he has been trying to occupy. Shamed of him. They consider him dangerous and toxic, which is why if you meet him, you do so behind closed doors. Yeah, that is how viral moments work. They become projection surfaces. The actual event was probably a few seconds of two people exchanging a greeting in a crowded arena. What it became online was a test of audience loyalty. I am not telling you the Spike Lee moment proved anything specific or unflattering. The footage is genuinely ambiguous, and I have no inside information about what either person was thinking. What I can say with certainty is that the enthusiasm with which a significant portion of the internet applied a particular reading to that ambiguity reflects a pre-existing mood about Harry's standing in the rooms he is trying to be in. They have the bloated salaries. They pay like 23 people over $100,000 a year for a 7-day. I mean, this is just insane. If it's giving you the full picture that other channels skip, the like button costs nothing and it keeps this channel going. Now, let's talk about the Time 100 recognition because the specific connections people have drawn here deserve careful examination rather than either reflexive dismissal or uncritical credulity. Harry was included in Time magazine's 100 most influential people in sport. The reaction followed a now familiar pattern. Questions about the basis of the selection. One of the most liked comments on the announcement asked simply, "Did he buy it?" That is a joke, not an allegation, but it generated 1,000 likes for the same reason the 8th row joke spread, because it expressed something a significant portion of the audience already believed. It's going to be a big, and this is the mood music, JJ. All of this builds up to a scenario in which the marriage is under pressure. The penny dropped for Harry realizing you've ruined my life. But then, observers began mapping something more specific. Time magazine's ownership structure has overlapping relationships with BetterUp, the well-being technology company where Harry serves as Chief Impact Officer. The relationship between Time's ownership network and BetterUp is documentable. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a traceable corporate relationship that people with Time and public filings can verify. The question that observers then asked, whether those connections influence the editorial decision to include Harry in the Time 100, is one that nobody outside Time magazine's editorial process can answer with certainty. I want to be precise about what kind of claim this is, because precision matters when the temptation is to treat a circumstantial connection as a confirmed cause, established fact. The connection between Time's ownership network and BetterUp exists and is documentable by anyone with access to public corporate filings. Claim that cannot currently be established from outside the decision-making process, that this connection influenced any specific editorial decision at Time magazine. Both of those statements can be simultaneously true without contradiction. Connections exist all the time without determining specific outcomes. A connection can exist without having influence a particular outcome. A connection can also exist and have influenced an outcome. The existence of the connection does not prove causation in either direction. What the overlap does, regardless of whether it influenced any specific decision in any specific case, is create a question that now travels with every high-profile recognition Harry receives and cannot be detached from it by a denial. The question does not go away by being unproven. It becomes part of how the recognition lands with a significant portion of the audience. That is the structural cost of having overlapping institutional connections in a media environment where people are more willing than ever to map those connections publicly and draw conclusions from the map even before causation is established. Meghan and Harry are reportedly so broke they can't even divorce. The legal fees would bankrupt Subscribe to us, so you never miss what we cover next. And while you are reading this, drop your take in the comments below. Do you think the BetterUp/Time connection influenced the recognition? Or is that reading too much into a circumstantial overlap? Now let's talk about Rachel Maxwell and the credit dispute because this became a genuinely interesting story within the Invictus story and because the question it raises goes beyond the specific individuals involved. They're having a total meltdown about Harry and Meghan now and saying just how isolated they are. And what a toxic brand they are. So the royal family don't want the Sussex brand anywhere near their very successful royal brand, Brad. Similarly, Hollywood, as we know, have turned their back on Harry and Meghan as well. Maxwell is an independent researcher who spent a significant amount of time reviewing publicly available financial documents connected to the Invictus Games, charitable accounts, government budget documents, public filings, the kind of painstaking, unglamorous work that involves reading documents that most people would not voluntarily choose to read and cross-referencing figures that require patience and attention to detail to interpret correctly. She identified the $63 million total cost, the per-competitor figure of approximately $118,000, the redacted licensing fee in the publicly available budget documents, the detail in the charitable accounts showing a reported 63% drop in direct grants to veterans organizations in the same period that total organizational income increased, and the addition of a new six-figure executive role in the same financial period when direct charitable giving was falling. She shared those findings online, without charge in the space where the people already following the Invictus financial questions were paying attention. What her supporters argue happened subsequently is that a well-known journalist with a major publication wrote a story covering many of the same financial questions, received the substantial public attention and professional credit that a major publication generates without sufficient acknowledgement of the independent research that had already surfaced and documented those questions. I am not in a position to adjudicate that dispute from the outside. I do not have access to either party's account of the process, and the journalist involved would have a different description of how the reporting came together. What I can say is that the question the situation raises is real and applies well beyond this specific case. Who does the detailed, patient, document-by-document accountability work on charitable organizations connected to high-profile figures who have significant media relationships and PR infrastructure working in their favor? And how does that work get recognized and rewarded when a larger platform with more reach and more institutional credibility picks up the conclusions and makes them news? The answer in this case was an independent researcher, does it? Shares it publicly, and then watches it become someone else's major story. Her online supporters made that dynamic visible by raising it loudly and persistently in comment sections and social media threads until the comparison between Maxwell's research and the subsequent mainstream coverage became part of the public conversation about the Invictus story itself. That visibility is itself a kind of accountability, not for the charitable organization's finances, but for the process by which investigative findings travel from the people who do the foundational work to the platforms that receive the attention. And whether that process acknowledges the former in the recognition it grants to the latter. Now, let's talk about the Invictus origins question, because this is the one that generates the strongest and most divided reactions. The official account, supported by Time magazine and repeated in mainstream coverage, is that Harry was inspired by attending the 2013 Warrior Games in the United States, that the experience motivated him to create an equivalent international competition for wounded veterans from multiple nations, and that he drove the founding from that inspiration. There is a competing account that circulates among people who were inside or adjacent to the institutional machinery at the time. That account holds that the early planning and organizational architecture for the Invictus Games came substantially through the Royal Foundation, which at the time included both Harry and William, and that Harry's role was as the inspirational and public-facing driver of a project whose infrastructure was built with institutional support he did not create himself. Some supporters of this version also reference William's legal settlement with certain British press organizations as a possible source of early funding. That specific claim has not been confirmed through any public documentation I have seen, and I hold it at arm's length accordingly. Here is how I think about the origins question. Two things can both be true. Harry can genuinely have been moved and inspired by the Warrior Games in 2013 in a way that was real and personal, and that led directly to his desire to create an equivalent international competition and the institutional machinery that turned that inspiration into a functioning international event: the legal structure, the funding relationships, the organizational capacity, the royal foundation network can have been substantially provided by the institution rather than built from scratch by Harry alone. These are not mutually exclusive accounts. Most large charitable ventures are built by a combination of a driving individual vision and institutional infrastructure that the individual did not create. The question is, how much credit attaches to the vision and how much to the infrastructure, and how that accounting changes when the individual takes the venture with them when they depart the institution that provided the infrastructure. What the origins question does is affect how you read the governance picture that follows. If the games are primarily Harry's creation and his responsibility, the financial governance questions are primarily his to answer publicly. If the games were built substantially on institutional infrastructure that he then took with him upon departure, the accountability picture becomes more complicated. More people are responsible for what the governance looks like. And the picture is messier than either the official account or the competing account fully describes. The Birmingham and San Diego chapters of this story add further layers that are worth examining in sequence. Birmingham is a city with well-documented and publicly discussed financial difficulties, budget cuts, service reductions, genuine pressure on the resources available to ordinary residents. It has also been publicly discussed as the host city for a future Invictus Games edition with significant public funding reportedly committed toward the event. The contrast between those two facts, the documented financial difficulty and the substantial public commitment to hosting a major international event, has not gone unnoticed by people who live and work in Birmingham. The version of the question being asked there is the version that tends to cut most sharply. How is there money for this, and not for the things we have been repeatedly told there is no money for? That is a legitimate question asked by people who have a direct and personal stake in the answer, and it is a version of the same question being asked from multiple directions about the $63 million Vancouver cost. The question is not whether the Invictus Games have value as a concept. The mission of supporting wounded and injured veterans through international athletic competition, of giving people who paid an extraordinary price a stage and a purpose, is real and worth supporting and worth spending money on. The question is whether the specific financial model, the cost structure per participant, the allocation of public and charitable funding between direct veteran support and organizational administration and executive compensation is primarily serving the veterans the mission describes or primarily serving the organization that has grown up around the mission. San Diego is reportedly being positioned for the 2029 Games, which projects the same cost structure debate into an American context. California is a state with its own publicly discussed budget pressures and competing priorities. For public, the question of how the games will be funded, what public contribution might be involved, and what the economic impact calculus will look like is already beginning to be asked in the relevant circles. Australia's withdrawal of a reported $9 million funding commitment added a specific and notable data point to this picture. The way the Withdrawal happened, with organizers reportedly learning about it shortly before it became public, without the extended consultation that major funding relationship changes usually involve, suggests a decision that was made with some urgency and communicated without the usual advance warning. Government funding decisions for charitable events do not typically happen that way unless something has shifted materially in the internal assessment of the relationship's value to the government making the commitment. Governments review these relationships. When the review produces a decision to withdraw $9 million on short notice, without extended consultation with the organization being withdrawn from, the conclusion of that review is visible even if the reasoning behind it is not publicly documented. What shifted in Australia's specific assessment is not publicly explained. The withdrawal is the explanation. Now, let me pull all of these threads together because separately they are several different stories and together they are one story about the same underlying dynamic. The connective tissue between all of them is a single question. What is the commercial and cultural value of the Sussex brand in 2026, measured not by what the brand claims for itself, but by the observable decisions of the organizations that have the most to gain or lose by associating with it? That is a question you can answer empirically, rather than speculatively. The NBA put Harry in the 8th row. Australia withdrew $9 million. Netflix restructured, and then ended the deal. Spotify did not renew, and its executive called them grifters. BetterUp and Time have an overlapping relationship that travels with Harry's recognition. The Invictus Games has 43 paying spectators at a wheelchair basketball match in Vancouver and a redacted licensing fee in a government-funded public document. None of those facts require interpretation to be significant. They speak for themselves at a factual level before any narrative is applied to them. The interpretation I am offering, that they describe a trajectory rather than a collection of isolated incidents, is mine, and you can reject it while accepting the facts. What you cannot do is accept the facts and, simultaneously, argue that they describe an operation whose commercial position is strengthening. The NBA 8th row, the Time 100 recognition, and its BetterUp context, the Invictus financial questions and Rachel Maxwell's research, the Birmingham and San Diego cost debates, the Australian withdrawal, these are not a single unified story. They are separate stories that happen to share an underlying dynamic. A person whose public profile, commercial value, institutional access, and capacity to attract recognition and invitation are all substantially connected to a royal title and institutional drama that is, by every available commercial and cultural indicator, generating diminishing returns over time rather than increasing ones. The 8th row is where you end up when your commercial value to the event has shifted from essential to optional, when having you there adds something but not enough to determine your placement. The Time 100 recognition generates the BetterUp question precisely because Harry's independent achievements, separate from the royal title and the institutional drama, are not yet sufficient to make the recognition obviously self-justifying without reference to the connections surrounding it. The Invictus.
There might not be.
What I can say is that the evidence available right now, the 8th row, the BetterUp connection, the Invictus governance questions, the brand traffic numbers, the Australian withdrawal, all points in the same direction, and that direction is not toward increasing independence from the institutional connection. What is your read? Do you think there is a version of the Sussex commercial operation that works without the ongoing royal drama as its primary engine, that builds something durable enough to function when the drama eventually becomes old news? And which of the stories we covered tonight struck you as the most significant single indicator of where things are actually heading? The 8th row, the BetterUp